Welcome, freedom fighters. Today, we're going to get into a huge aspect of the culture war, which is gender theory, modern gender ideology, the sex education that our children are going through, the roots of it, where it came from. Contrary to popular belief, the history of gender theory, people think started with Dr. John Money. But Dr. John Money only tested the theory of it, which he took from Simone de Beauvoir. And Simone was kind of influenced by her lover, Paul Sartre. So we'll get into 15 minutes of Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre first, just to drive home where this theory came from, with a short little background on them. It'll be about 15 minutes. We'll start out with a quote from Simone, which should really drive it home, and then we'll work our way into Dr. John Money, and eventually we'll get to Alfred Kinsey, who is basically the father of modern sex education. You get into Alfred Kinsey, be prepared to be completely grossed out. It's absolutely horrific stuff. He was a pedophile, and it's absolutely sickening. And this is the basis of how pedophiles are charged today. And as I stated, it's the basis of our modern sex education. So let's get into it. It's going to be a long one. I'll probably break it up into a two-part series. So stay tuned. Thanks, guys.
One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine.
In her book, she explains how women's liberation is intimately related to the fate of socialism.
As socialism, true socialism, establishes economic equality among all peoples, the feminist movement learned it had to establish equality between the sexes by taking power away from the ruling class within the movement, that is, from men. Put another way, once inside the class struggle, women understood the class struggle does not eliminate the sex struggle. By limiting women to tiresome, empty, monotonous household tasks, marriage mutilates and annihilates the wife. In marriage, her life is virtually finished forever. Society, being codified by man, decrees that woman is inferior. She can do away with this inferiority only by destroying male's superiority.
De Beauvoir embraced Karl Marx's evil dualistic conflict theory of oppressor and oppressed that would polarize our society and shape our culture of death.
In the Communist Manifesto, you see statements like this: abolition of the family, exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. Wow, 1848, abolition of the family was already an infamous proposal of the communists? I mean, this is the programmatic statement, the manifesto of the Communist Party. And already then, even before the manifesto was out, this was known as an infamous proposal of the communists. And they say, one paragraph after that, the bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. And then get this, do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime, we plead guilty.
Simone's rejection of religion led her to study and teach philosophy and to write her first novels. De Beauvoir chose as the epitaph of her first novel the words of Karl Marx's master, Friedrich Hegel. Each consciousness pursues the death of the other. Since the other, for de Beauvoir, would be motherhood in Western civilization. Birth control and abortion would become for her the sacraments of her lifestyle. Simone met Jean-Paul Sartre in 1929 at the Sorbonne in Paris, and soon after moved in with him. His relationship became the greatest influence on her life and work. Sartre was a philosopher, playwright, novelist, and political activist. His novel, Nausea, is in some ways the modern manifesto of atheistic existentialism, one without a God and no human nature, except the one which she alone would design. Sartre is called the philosopher of the 20th century, fitting for the death of God century that would shape the greatest genocidal holocaust in the history of the world.
Existentialism is nothing else than an attempt to draw all the consequences of a coherent atheistic position. Man is nothing else than what he makes of himself. To choose to be this or that is to affirm at the same time the value of what we choose, because we can never choose evil. Without God, all things are permissible.
Key to de Beauvoir's life and influence was that she would agree with what Sartre's book, Being and Nothingness, demonstrated. That
essence does not precede existence. In pure subjectivity, the human being is not anything. He is measured by his acts.
Sartre was an apologist for tyranny and terror. He was a supporter of Stalin, Mao, and Castro. Sartre's ideas inspired the Khmer Rouge leadership and the events in Cambodia in the 1970s, in which between 1/5 and 1/3 of the nation was starved to death or murdered. This was the work of a group of intellectuals who were, for the most part, pupils and admirers of Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre called for violence and death in his preface to Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, endorsing his devotees' neo-colonial Marxism that would later devastate Africa.
Simone de Beauvoir's paramour, Jean-Paul Sartre, gave the philosophical principle behind this that eventually devolved into the transgender self-mutilation. And that is that existence precedes essence. Now, one would have to have studied a little metaphysics to understand the consequences of such a statement. Existence precedes essence means that you somehow exist without a nature. You're not anything, really, which leaves you in a very precarious situation, and thus the angst of existentialism. So how do you become something if you have existence but no essence? Well, you have to obtain an essence through your own will. So what becomes paramount is will rather than reason. Reason was there to apprehend the nature of reality, but if existence precedes essence, there is no nature of reality, and will becomes paramount. And this, of course, is the key of the 20th century ideologies, totalitarian ideologies, which for Hitler was triumph of the will on a race-based theory of man, or the communist class-based theory of man, both of them based on the primacy of will as against reason. So what we're seeing today in the transgender and the whole LGBT agenda is downstream from Sartre and de Beauvoir, just living out the full implications of what it means if you exist before you have an essence.
De Beauvoir lived with Sartre. Breaking with moral traditions, they never married, seeking a freedom outside monogamy. Their so-called open relationship gave them license to form all kinds of sexual relationships with others, both men and women.
I blamed us. Myself as much as you, actually. In the past, in the future, in the absolute, the way we treat people. I felt it was unacceptable.
In his diaries, Sartre wrote that he enjoyed being a scholarly Don Juan, slaying women through the power of my golden tongue. Nothing struck me as more moving than the moment at which the avowal of love is finally wrenched forth. After that would happen, he rarely knew what to do with his conquests.
In itself, homosexuality is as limiting as heterosexuality. The idea should be to be capable of loving a woman or a man, either, a human being, without feeling fear, restraint, or obligation. I am too intelligent, too demanding, too resourceful for anyone to take charge of me entirely. No one knows me or loves me completely. I have only myself.
Simone never had children. She kept a kind of bond with Sartre as long as he lived. The philosopher Merleau-Ponty turned on its head the classical view of the human person, with a hierarchy, a primacy to God over soul and its faculties of memory, intellect, and will over the body. Merleau-Ponty eliminated God and gave primacy to the body and feelings, to what he termed embodiment and the flesh of the world, giving elite academic credence to the dumbing down of culture.
The body is our anchorage in the world. I am not in front of my body, I am in it, or rather, I am it. If we can still speak of interpretation in relation to the perception of one's own body, we shall have to say that it interprets itself. We know not through our intellect, but through our experience.
The outbreak of World War II in 1939 and the German occupation of France in 1940 also contributed to her philosophical perspective.
Robots over France are direct targets for our gunners. New weapons of war add to the increasing thrills recorded by intrepid cameramen.
From 1943 to 1944, during the Nazi occupation of France, de Beauvoir, without coercion and with other options, chose freely to work for Radio Vichy, the communications pawn in France for the National Socialist Party. Dr. Ingrid Galster, an expert on Simone de Beauvoir, termed her job as a sound director in the Nazi propaganda machine to be at the very least subtle collaboration. The Telegraph also reported that the reason she couldn't keep her teaching job was her procuring for Jean-Paul Sartre's pedophilia addiction. In 1943, Simone de Beauvoir was fired for her behavior leading to the corruption of a minor.
Absurdity challenges every ethics. But also, the finished rationalization of the real would leave no room for ethics. It is because man's condition is ambiguous that he seeks through failure and outrageousness to save his existence. I feel something inside of me which scares me, an exhausting violence. But I accept the great adventure of being me.
After the war, through Les Temps Modernes, the monthly journal founded by she and Sartre in 1945, they attempted to create a cultural Marxist socialism, one less dependent on the brutal, bloody forms of World War II.
Equality between men and women will be possible when the socialist society is realized worldwide. When there would no longer be men and women, but only workers, equal with one another. Formerly, I thought that the class struggle had to happen before the struggle between the sexes. Now, I find it necessary to lead them both together. The fact is that men encounter more complicity in their women companions than the oppressor usually finds in the oppressed. And in bad faith, they use it as a pretext to declare that a woman wanted the destiny that a man imposed on her.
De Beauvoir's The Second Sex was published in 1949. It called for the moral revolution of existentialism, which reverses the principle that essence precedes existence.
One is not born, but rather becomes a
Are you
woman.
beginning to understand?
No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine.
In her book, she explains how women's liberation is intimately related to the fate of socialism.
As socialism, true socialism, establishes economic equality among all peoples, the feminist movement learned it had to establish equality between the sexes by taking power away from the ruling class within the movement, that is, from men. Put another way, once inside the class struggle, women understood the class struggle does not eliminate the sex struggle.
While she was writing Second Sex, de Beauvoir was editing the Marxist journal Modern Times. Throughout her life, she and Sartre exhibited their support for communism, especially for the Frankfurt School's critical theory, its sexual revolution, and multiculturalism.
Now that we exposed how Marxist de Beauvoir and Sartre basically started the gender theory that you're not born a woman, you become a woman, starting this whole theory that you could pick your gender, basically. We're going to move on to Dr. Money. Dr. Money tested her theory on two twin boys, the Reimer brothers. It's a very sick story. I recommend, if you want to learn the whole story, the full documentary, Dr. Money and the Boy Without a Penis, is on YouTube. Look it up, watch it. It's extremely disturbing. So from here, we'll move on to getting into Dr. Money. I'll start off with a clip from Matt Walsh and then two short clips from YouTube channels, just going into a short history of Dr. Money. I won't go too deep into him, but you'll see how sick he was. And this test that he did on these boys is basically what started, well, first of all, he touted that this test was an extreme success when it was an utter, complete failure. And both boys ended up later dying. One killed himself, one OD'd. They lived like horrible lives. You'll see that in the coming clips. And then we'll end this part of the series with who later became David Reiner's last interview. And that last clip is taken from the documentary Dr. Money and the Boy Without a Penis. So let's get started. We'll start out with Matt Walsh, and we'll work our way through a couple clips.
None of this is new, at least not as new as it may seem. The roots of modern gender ideology can be traced all the way back to the 19th century, in fact, arguably even earlier than that. But it really began to take its current shape in the mid-20th century thanks to the work of two hideously evil crackpots named Alfred Kinsey and John Money. These are names that everybody should know and few people do. In the interest of time, I'll focus on John Money for just a moment. It's worth looking into Alfred Kinsey, though. We talk about him in the film a little bit, but an even deeper dive is worthwhile. If you do, in fact, do that, make sure to have a vomit bucket handy.
He ain't lying. Kinsey is absolutely sick.
As for John Money, he was a prominent psychologist and sexologist and one of the early pioneers of the gender theories that are currently taught in grade schools and universities. He was among the first to take the word gender out of the realm of grammar and apply it to people. Because until him, we never said that people have a gender. Well, people have a sex, and gender is, words have gender. But he said, no, people have gender and sex. And he coined that. He also coined the terms gender role, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Suffice it to say, he was an extremely influential man, and anybody who propagates left-wing gender theory today is repeating at least some of the ideas of John Money, whether they know it or not, and most of them do not know it.
Facts.
That fact, I think, ought to trouble gender theory proponents because John Money was, among other things, a fraud and an abuser and a pedophile. Jumping to 1965, the birth of twins Bruce and Brian Reimer, the boys are born healthy except for a condition called phimosis, which affects the foreskin. And it was decided incorrectly, it turns out, that the best way to treat the condition was circumcision. But Bruce's procedure went horribly wrong and his penis was essentially burned off. After several months of grasping for answers, Bruce's parents eventually decided to take him to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to see the renowned gender surgeon, Dr. John Money. And the good doctor, eager to prove the legitimacy of his theory that gender is a product of environment and culture, recommended that Bruce undergo sex reassignment surgery. So before the age of 2, the deed had been done, his testicles were removed, some crude approximation of female genitalia was formed, and Money instructed his parents to raise him as a girl and said that, well, this will work perfectly because gender is a social construct, so create a social construct of femininity for him, and he will be a her, and that will be it, happily ever after.
What are the origins of gender identity? And where did the concept of gender begin to stray from early dictionary definitions? In the 1950s, a psychologist and sexologist, Dr. John William Money, began applying the word gender when describing someone's sexual identity. His concept and use of the word was not widely adopted until much later, but Dr. Money is seen as a pioneer on the psychology of gender fluidity, identity, and expression. He believed that an individual's gender was a social construct that was determined by their upbringing and subsequent exposure to what society deems to be masculine or feminine. His argument was that nurture overrides nature.
Bruce Reimer was a boy born in Winnipeg, Canada, alongside his twin brother Brian on August 22, 1965. As the twins started growing, they showed some problems urinating due to phimosis, a condition in which foreskin cannot be pulled back off the head of the penis. When the boys were 7 months old, their parents Janet and Ronald Reimer took them to get circumcised in order to fix the problem. What the parents didn't know was that the doctor in charge of the circumcision was using a method of cauterization, a burning technique, instead of a traditional blade. During the procedure, Bruce Reimer suffered a horrible accident which resulted in his penis being burnt off. His parents were devastated by this, and after hearing of their son's accident, they decided against having his brother Brian circumcised, whose phimosis later cleared on its own. While questioning whether or not their son would be happy as a male with no penis, their mother happened to be watching a show on television that featured a psychologist named Dr. John Money, who specialized in biology of gender and sexual identity. He appeared charismatic, intelligent, and confident, and he was also well respected and reputable in his field by his peers. He had a theory that gender was not something you were born into, but something learned through socialization and upbringing. The parents felt this was the answer to their son's problem, so they contacted Dr. Money and told him of their situation. Dr. Money invited them to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore to meet with him. After discussing the matter, the doctor convinced the parents that it would be in their son's best interest to raise him as a girl. So it began. That while his brother Brian was raised like a boy, Bruce was raised as a girl and was given the new name Brenda. At 22 months old, his testicles were removed, he was given dolls and other girlish toys to play with, pretty dresses to wear, and as instructed, they did not tell Brenda about his accident. He and his brother would both go to yearly appointments to see Dr. Money so he could keep watch on Brenda's progress. It's worth mentioning that the twins were a perfect experiment for him to test his nurtured not natured theory, given the circumstance that there were two of them from the same genes for him to compare to each other. However, some issues arose. His parents and the doctor could see that he was showing more masculinity than he was feminine qualities. His brother Brian would share his toys with Brenda because Brenda was happier playing with things boys played with, and playing games that boys normally played. Brenda showed no sign of feeling like a female. If Brenda didn't fully accept being female as his identity, it would disprove Dr. Money's theory and his book about gender being a result of social construction. At 7 years old, the boys started to be subjected to more sexualized experiments, like being asked what the differences are between boys and girls, and taught the sexual roles played by men and women. The doctor would make them role-play the positions themselves, like Brian standing behind Brenda and leaning his crotch against his brother's behind. He would also force the boys to inspect each other's genitals. On one occasion, he had the children undress and took nude photographs of them. If the children did not do as asked, the doctor would yell at them, to the point where they thought they would be struck. The children did not like the sessions with the doctor, but they didn't tell their parents what was going on. It was also around this age, Dr. Money tried talking Brenda into going through an operation that would completely change his parts to what he told Brenda they were supposed to look like a girl. Brenda was very scared of the thought and refused. Later on, when Brenda was becoming a teenager, the doctor made one last attempt to convince him about the operation. He invited another patient of his, a transgender female who had undergone an operation willingly, to talk with Brenda. It was after this that Brenda told his parents that he would kill himself if he had to see the doctor again. It was at this time the parents felt it was best to tell their sons the truth. Ron took Brenda out for ice cream, while Janet took Brian elsewhere so they could individually tell their sons the truth, that Brenda was actually born a boy. Brenda, after being told that he was actually born a male, felt immense relief. He felt like himself and he was happy. His brother, however, could not handle the situation and took great shock to the news that his sister was actually his brother.
These
the
poor
events
kids,
surrounding
man,
Brenda
this is so
caused a
sad.
mental disturbance in Brian Reimer that would eventually lead to schizophrenia and his detachment from his brother. Brenda was ready to take on his new life and renamed himself David. Before, he was excluded by the kids in school for his differences, teased and tormented, and felt different from everyone. Now he started making friends, had positive thoughts about the future, and embraced his identity as a boy. He started taking testosterone supplements to counteract the effects of estrogen hormones that the doctor had given to him over the years. This led to him getting a double mastectomy to remove his hormone-induced female breasts, and 2 phalloplasty operations to recreate his penis. He also received a sum of money for the botched circumcision. Eventually, David met a woman named Jane Fontaine who had 3 children. They fell in love, got married, and David was happy with his new life. Things seemed to be looking up for him. However, things changed when David heard that Dr. Money was informing people that his experiment with David wanting to be a girl was a success, and nothing could be further from the truth. This caused David to get a hold of his brother so they could speak out against the doctor, in the hopes of keeping other children from having to go through what he did. Brian agreed, and they opened up to the world about the truth of their history with Dr. Money. Later, in 2002, Brian Reimer was found dead after overdosing on antidepressants. Aside from David having to deal with his brother's death, he was conned out of $65,000 in a bad deal and was having trouble finding work. He was also having problems with his marriage, in which his wife asked for separation time. On May 2, 2004, David sawed off the end of a shotgun and drove to a nearby grocery store where he shot himself in the head. He was 38 years old when he took his life.
An absolute tragedy. Now we're going to get into David Reimer's last
After David
interview,
died, there was an outcry.
which will be at the end
Dr.
of this
Money
clip.
did not cause
And he
David's
gave the
death,
warning. It's just
but his family felt that
such
he
a
was
sick
partly
story, and the fact that
responsible.
Dr. Money went around
Because
talking
Dr.
about
Money
this
had
as if
pursued
this
his theory
experiment
in the
was a
face of
success is
convincing
just
evidence that the
mind-blowing.
gender assignment had not worked. They felt that he had traumatized their son in childhood to the extent that he became suicidal as an adult.
I would like to say to Dr. Money, I would like to ask him if he could be man enough to admit to the public and to even to himself that he made a mistake. He was trying to make history, and it wasn't working.
As it became clear that it wasn't working, he could not let go of the case. It was too beautiful for him to let go of it, and I think that that was unethical behavior on his part.
Horizon asked Dr. Money to participate in this documentary, but he declined. His former student, Richard Green, argues that Dr. Money did the best he could in an era when we knew less.
With the benefit of hindsight, based on what we knew at the time about how you become male or female or boy or a girl, with the advantage of hindsight, knowing the difficulties, to say the least, of creating a penis surgically, the decision that John Money made at the time was the correct one, and I would have made the same one at that time.
Well, what a sick person. And he created thousands of professors like him.
What we do know is that Dr. Money's theory
is
that it is
absolute
possible
crap.
to raise a boy as a girl does not seem to hold true for most children. Nature, as far as gender identity is concerned, cannot be overridden by nurture.
Now listen
Above
to David's
all,
final
this is a
interview. It's
cautionary
absolutely
tale.
heartbreaking, and he
This
left
is
a
what can
warning in
happen
this
when
interview.
science pursues a beautiful theory with scant regard for the human cost.
You're always going to see people that are going to say, well, the Dave Reimer case could have been successful. I'm living proof. And if you're not going to take my word as gospel, because I have lived through it, who else are you going to listen to? Who else is there? I've lived through it. Is it going to take somebody to wind up killing themselves, shooting themselves in the head for people to listen?
Are you listening yet?